All right, what's going on, everyone? I got another not sponsored by deal here. You all know the Fat Electrician. He does these really funny videos on YouTube tied to military history. I'll put a link to his channel below if you want to check it out. But anyways, I got one of his sweatshirts a couple weeks ago, and it's great. It's comfortable, fits well. I'm all about it. But as soon as this one came in, I kind of lost the argument to hold on to an older sweatshirt that was full of holes. And I really like that one. It's not the Fat Electrician's fault that I had to get rid of the best sweatshirt that I had, but I do blame him for that loss. But enough about that. Let's get into some updates around the war in Ukraine. All right, handful of items caught my attention over the last week or so that I thought were worth discussing. We had HIMARS strikes pretty deep inside Russian territory. The Battle of Bakhmut continues to be a pretty nasty grind. There were some protests in Germany, which really wasn't anything new, but we talk about how those tie in to the war in Ukraine at a high level. The U.S. appears to be ready to ship Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. And finally, we're going to wrap up with some interesting commentary from a Russian military blogger who is critical of the Russian military performance so far in the war. Rather than keep this tied exclusively to HIMARS, I'm going to talk more broadly about deep strikes. HIMARS has been the predominant means of carrying these out, but as the attacks on the Russian airfields with the Tu-141 drones, assuming that is what was used, it's likely Ukraine has additional capabilities to conduct these attacks far behind the front lines. And just this last week, it was reported that a building being used as a headquarters for the Wagner Group was struck and destroyed in Luhansk. Looking at the pictures from the Luhansk strike here, the building was very clearly destroyed, totally gutted. The casualties and the impact of the overall fight are up for debate, as is so often the case. Ukraine claims in some of the reports I've seen to have killed upwards of 200 fighters, whereas the Russian discussions about this strike have the casualty count down around 3, I think it was. But either way, what stands out to me here is not the ability to conduct the strike, the precision, or the damage of the building, but the targeting. What I mean is how Ukraine was able to determine the location of a headquarters in order to carry out this strike. I don't know the exact techniques being used in this war to camouflage a headquarters facility, but that's something that's likely adapted over time. For instance, at the start of the war, Russia could have set up a big, sprawling headquarters complex with antennas and command vehicles everywhere, because so long as it was at least, say, 20 miles behind the front lines, it wasn't really at risk of being hit. But today, that's different. The amount of satellite imagery and drone coverage paired with Ukraine's now deep strike ability means a command post has to be difficult to spot if it's going to survive. We haven't heard a lot about human intelligence and sources on the ground identifying, kind of marking targets for quite a while in this war, but it can't be ruled out, especially when it comes to targets in occupied areas of Ukraine, just like this supposed strike on the Wagner headquarters was in Luhansk. Now, I don't have any information to suggest that's what happened here, some sort of human intelligence reporting on the ground. Entirely likely it was standard ISR that identified the building over a period of time. Just wanted to bring up the on-the-ground targeting possibility. Moving over to Bakhmut, the situation there hasn't really changed much over the last couple weeks. There's still pictures and videos coming out that are pretty graphic, especially those from the Wagner Group Telegram channel. Both sides continue to claim that the other side is racking up substantial casualties, and it's likely that both are correct. Russia is on the offensive there, which tends to produce more casualties, but they do likely outmatch Ukraine in firepower, at least in that immediate area. The air war piece has been hard to dial in from the get-go of this conflict, but it does seem like Russia is using a fair number of close air support aircraft in and around Bakhmut. And regardless of how effective they are in that fight, we're generally not seeing nearly as much of that from the Ukrainian side. Troop dispositions are never public information or should not be public information, but there has been what I'll call spotted reporting coming out that both sides have reinforced Bakhmut pretty heavily over the last couple weeks. Overall, a quick look at the change in territory around Bakhmut over the last month. On the left, we have Bakhmut on 15 November 2022. On the right, 15 December 2022, 1 month later. This is a poll from Live UA Map. The red marks areas taken by Russia. It's not exact, not by a long shot, but I think it gives you an idea of the flow of the battle. Now, in terms of the value of the city, Bakhmut, some argue that it opens the door to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Others, myself included, tend to think that taking Bakhmut wouldn't be as significant a victory as Russia maybe had hoped. This is pure armchair general speculation. I'm not going to pretend to have more information or be anywhere near as knowledgeable as the commanders on the ground actually fighting this fight. The reason that I personally don't think it will be that big of an impact if Bakhmut changes hands is if we look back at the start of the war, major crossroads and cities were all the talk, right? It was the idea that when one town or area falls, Russia could sprint forward to the next before Ukraine has the ability to set up their defenses. But that really just hasn't played out since the opening week or two of the war. Especially as this fight drags on around Bakhmut, I would expect that Ukraine has established defensive positions in depth behind the forward lines so that if it does fall, the whole front doesn't collapse. And that's kind of how I see this playing out. Russia very well may take this town in the coming weeks or months, which shifts the line a little bit before returning to the overall kind of slow grind that we've seen for a little while now. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the protests in Germany in light of how they might impact the war in Ukraine. I'm no expert in German politics, so I'm not going to try to go in depth or provide any detailed analysis here. But at a very high level, there have been protests as of late tied to things like inflation, cost of living, energy, and a handful of other items. One area that at least some of the protesters have targeted is the sanctions against Russia and how those might be impacting the day-to-day lives of German citizens. I might have to invite somebody on here to talk about this because, again, it's a little outside my wheelhouse. Things like German domestic politics, energy policy, the impact of sanctions on broader Europe, and more. But I wanted to bring this up because Ukraine is in a unique position where they're dependent on Western support to continue this fight, and that's something that isn't entirely in their control. I mean, I don't know how impactful these protests in Germany will be and if it has or will have any influence on their support of Ukraine. I've talked about this reliance on Western aid before, and I don't mean in any way to diminish the fighting that the Ukrainian people are doing. At the end of the day, it's Ukrainians that are fighting and dying on the battlefield, protecting their homes, and I don't want to take anything away from that. I'd say that it's pretty well accepted, however, that if all Western aid were to shut off, as an extreme example, Ukraine would not be able to continue this fight indefinitely. It's a tough spot for Ukraine. There's no two ways about it. I don't personally see a decrease, at least in terms of U.S. support in the near future, but there are so many variables that it's just impossible to predict, and that's an interesting dynamic of this war. All right, let's talk about Patriots. On December 13th, the United States announced they were finalizing plans to send Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine. The Patriot is the primary surface-to-air missile in use by the United States today, and we've exported it to a handful of allied countries around the world. But the location of these Patriots has been a pretty hot-button issue for Russia for quite a while. They don't want missile interceptors anywhere near their border, but since the war has started, we've seen Patriots installed in Poland, and now it appears Ukraine. These are pretty fancy pieces of equipment. They take quite a while to train operators to become proficient in them. I'm talking about months of hands-on experience. I have no doubt that Ukraine will be able to figure this out and operate these effectively, but I have to imagine there's a pretty serious training and support operation being put in place right now. Worth stating real quick that I haven't seen any sort of timeline in terms of when these could be approved for transfer, when they would be shipped, when they would be ready to operate, or anything like that. So technically, I suppose it could be a long time before they're fielded on the battlefields of Ukraine, so we'll just have to wait and see as more information comes out. Since the beginning of this war, there's been arguments against sending Ukraine advanced military hardware because of the training and logistics tail needed to keep them operational for any significant period of time. These are some, not all, but some of the points made to suggest things like the F-16 and the Abrams should not be sent. Now, every weapon system is different. They have different needs, different training, and we can't compare, the HIMARS to the Patriot to the F-16. But I wonder if this change, realistically, the Patriot is the most advanced weapon system the United States has sent to date. I wonder if that opens the door for some of these other capabilities that have quickly been shot down in the past. Last but not least, I wanted to show some feedback from inside the Russian war machine. Igor Girkin is a unique individual. He served in the Russian army, worked in the FSB, and led separatist fighters in Donetsk back in 2014 when the war kicked off. He's been charged with shooting down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 that killed 298 people. He's been sanctioned individually by a ton of countries all around the world and has become a rather prominent pro-war blogger in support of the current Russian war in Ukraine. He's a pretty extreme figure, isn't really part of Putin or the Russian government, inner circle. Even if we extend that circle out to news agencies and reporters, he's not in the in group. However, he does have contacts across the Russian military and has been pretty pro-war since the start. So I think it's interesting to see some of his recent thoughts. Now, it bugs me a little bit when people pick and choose when they listen to certain opinions. Like someone is crazy, for example, and they're written off until they say something we agree with, and then they're, a reliable source. So I want to be careful not to imply that whatever Girkin says here is 100% accurate simply because he's questioning Russia's ability to win this war. It's one data point. Take it for what you will. On Telegram, in the post linked in the description below, he said, quote, "In parts of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, soldiers and officers do not understand for what purposes they are fighting at all. It is a mystery to them, and the Russian authorities are not able to explain this to them." He continues, "The lack of a clear military political strategy does not allow the military to develop tactics that will contribute to its implementation. In the meantime, the armed forces of the Russian Federation are preparing for a protracted positional war, building long-term structures along the entire front," what you see in this picture here. And I believe this imagery was taken from Kherson recently. And he continues, "The fact that following the strategy of a protracted war is suicide for the Russian Federation and its authorities and elites." It was a long rant. I'm just pulling out a couple snippets here. But anyways, the last piece here from Girkin is he says, quote, "Therefore, watching how the enemy slowly and without encountering any opposition implements its own strategic objectives with the complete passivity of the military and political authorities of the Russian Federation, I do not expect anything good in the coming weeks at the front. And yes, the so-called Ukraine will not freeze in winter, will not rebel, and will not fight worse. Conversely, its soldiers, who have already believed in their strength as a result of the autumn victories of the armed forces of Ukraine and are under the full protection of NATO, will only fight more fiercely and more stubbornly, avenging the hardships that their relatives and loved ones are forced to bear in the rear." Take that all with a grain of salt. I just thought it was interesting that a Russian pro-war military blogger was so critical not just of Russia's current strategy, but the outlook going forward in this war. All right, there's obviously a lot more that happened in Ukraine over the last couple weeks than we covered here. Just a couple items that caught my attention, but that'll do it for now. We'll see y'all next time.